Hey everyone, this is going to be a comparison and test of 3 free tape plugins that you can get right now. Furthest to the left we have GB Sound Tape Bus, in the middle we have Caelum Audio Tape Cassette 2, and furthest to the right we have ChowDSP Chow Tape Model. I'm not going to go into extreme detail about every single control and all these plugins, but I'm going to give you an overview of why I think they're cool, what makes them unique from each other, and how you can use them in your productions. The track that you're currently listening to in the background has instances of all 3 of these plugins applied to it, and I think tape plugins in particular are great for making stale or uninteresting sounds come to life in unique ways and give them very cool retro vintage sounds. I'm going to bump the backing track so you can hear what it sounds like with these plugins on it, and then I'm going to go into detail about each individual plugin and why they're worth checking out. Thanks. First, let's talk a little bit about each individual plugin, starting with GB Sound Tape Bus. I have the user manual open, and it reads, "This plugin recreates the behavior of the hardware circuitry when it is subjected to work in the nonlinear or saturation zone." I'm not sure exactly what hardware they're referring to. Obviously, it's some sort of tape unit. On the one hand, an analog bus emulation, and on the other, the typical treble compression in the recording of magnetic tape. In recording with tape recorders, a high-frequency compensating circuit is included in the recording step that amplifies them, pre-emphasis, to subsequently attenuate them in the reproduction, de-emphasis. For this reason, when we force the circuitry with greater sound signal pitch, it creates a compression of the high frequencies from 20 to 50 Hz up, I'm guessing, creating the typical sound stuck and crushed, producing a greater sustain and a better insertion in the mix. This is the simplest plugin out of all of them. You can see there's 2 LEDs at the top, one for the incoming signal, one for the peak signal. You have a very simple mix fader with auto gain. You have a high frequency processor knob and an on-off emphasis switch. The next plugin is ChowDSP Chow Tape Model. It has a very detailed user guide that goes through all of the controls in the plugin. If you're willing to put the time into reading the entire manual, you can get even more out of this plugin than what I'm using it for. The user manual reads, "Chow Tape is an analog tape machine physical model, originally based on the Sony TC260. The current version can be used to emulate a wide variety of reel-to-reel tape machines. As well as a tool for mixing engineers and producers, Chow Tape is a research project on developing physics-based models of analog tape emulation." There's a lot here in the user manual if you're willing to read through the entire thing. It might be worth it if you're going to use this as your primary tape plugin, or you could do what I do and simply mess around with the controls until you get a sound that you're looking for. It also goes into quite a bit of detail regarding the science behind analog tape recording and analog tape emulation. For all of the interesting controls that the plugin has, it has a pretty attractive GUI that's simple to navigate and simple to use even for beginners, as well as quite a few different presets that can get you started with some sounds that you may have difficulty dialing in at first. Next is Tape Cassette 2 by Caelum Audio. I just picked this plugin up recently, even though it's been out for a while. This is a really interesting, really great sounding cassette tape emulation plugin. Tape Cassette 2 is an audio plugin that emulates the warmth, noise, and character of old tape cassettes. Following up from our well-received Tape Cassette 1, we've updated the plugin with a sleek interface and more changes under the hood too. Along with a brand new selectable Type 1 cassette impulse response, we've improved the saturation algorithm, wow and flutter engine, and implemented real-time sampled tape noise, all of which result in a wonderfully warm and more accurate vintage sound. In addition to this, you now have 2 VU meters to monitor your audio, as well as selectable oversampling. Now you can easily add that classic sound to an entire track or use it directly on individual channels for added movement, texture, and warmth. Alternatively, you can take it further than the material limitations of tape and push the parameters into a far more experimental soundscape as a sound design tool. Selectable Type 1 cassette impulse response, dynamic saturation curve algorithm implementing hysteresis and including oversampling, wow and flutter engines rebuilt to focus on smoother emulation, real sampled noise from a Type 1 cassette, low-pass range increase down to 5 kHz. Although Tape Cassette 2 has a much simpler layout and fewer controls than ChowDSP Chow Tape, I found myself going to this plugin because sometimes it's easier to dial in the sound I'm looking for quickly, even though there's some limitations to the plugin. I've also found when it comes to adding saturation to things like basses, I find myself grabbing Tape Cassette 2 before Chow Tape, simply because I can dial in the saturation with one knob and get a really crunchy, gritty sound that I sometimes have trouble getting out of Chow Tape. Let's try these 3 plugins out on different sound sources, starting with a Contact library, Get Good Drums Modern and Massive. I have a simple rock beat, and I'm going to turn on the plugins at different times, mess with some of the controls so you can hear some of the sounds you can expect to get out of them. Let's start with GB Sound Tape Bus. Even when maxed out, Tape Bus has a pretty subtle sound compared to the other 2 plugins. It does a good job of gluing the components of that drum kit together and adds some nice saturation to the snare drum and the cymbals. Those are the most noticeable in my opinion. The emphasis option and knob definitely changes how much tape saturation you're getting on high frequencies. I don't find that particularly useful, but that just might be for my own applications. But overall, this plugin does one thing, it does it pretty well, and if that's what you're looking for, just slap one plugin on, push a fader up to get that tape emulation sound. This could be a great option. Now let's do the same test with Tape Cassette 2. I think using Tape Cassette 2 on a whole drum mix is a bit of a dramatic example, but to demonstrate what the different controls do, it works really well. I think the saturation in this plugin is one of the defining features. If you push that saturation really far and overdrive the plugin, you get a great, gritty, garage drum kind of sound, and that applies to any other sound source you might be testing it on. Having the option for emulated cassette tape noise is great as well. Having the option for tape wow and flutter is great as well, although you're limited in terms of being able to change the rate of wow and flutter. Still, if you use them subtly on something like a drum mix, you're going to get a great sound out of it. And what I really like about this plugin as well is you can drive it with the saturation knob and keep auto gain on, and it doesn't make your sound source any louder to trick your ears into thinking it sounds better. It's very reflective of just the processing that the plugin's doing. I don't think this plugin uses a lot of CPU, so you can do some high quality oversampling and get a cleaner sound out of it. You can also create your own presets or use some of the presets in the drop-down menu here. Now let's move on to Chow Tape model. That's the first time I've actually gone through most of the presets built into Chow Tape, and I'm really impressed by them. I think there's a bunch of usable presets. Obviously, this is the most versatile plugin out of the three because of the vast amount of controls you have, but it can be a bit more complicated for a beginner who just wants a quick cassette or tape machine sound. Even so, this is worth having, not only because it's free, but also because it sounds amazing, and I think you can use it on any type of source or a mix as a whole and get a great result from it. Now let's check out the differences between the plugins on a synth bass. Next, I have a stock Logic synth pad sound called Chill Out Pad. I intentionally chose kind of a harsh, gritty sound because I think using something like a tape emulation plugin can have a great effect on gritty, harsh top end frequencies. Taking a very clean sound like an 808 sub bass that's basically just a simple sine wave and putting these tape emulation plugins on it can give your ears a really good idea of the exact impact that the tape saturation plugins are having on the sound source. If you're going for that modern lo-fi hip-hop sound, you can use some of these tape emulation plugins to give an otherwise artificial and sterile sound, like some of the stock Logic pianos, that lo-fi vintage recorded feel as well as the wow and flutter that comes with tape recordings. Great example of that is this stock Yamaha studio piano I have in Logic. Let's take a look at the lo-fi hip-hop demo track I made for this free tape plugin showcase. Everything in this project is built into Logic or a free plugin that you can get. I used a stock Yamaha studio piano in Logic, a stock distorted electric piano, an Alchemy preset dark plucked bass, Alchemy preset 808 bass. I did use a battery hi-hat, but you can find a very similar hi-hat in Logic if you look deep enough. I used the Tight Trap Drum Machine Designer kit for the kick and snare. I also used the same kit for the hi-hat, and I used the Redline Drum Machine Designer kit for some additional perk sounds. This is just a drum bus where I'm summing all of my drum sounds to an instance of Chow Tape. The only other plugin I used in this demo is this Caelum Audio Flux Mini volume shaping plugin. It's also free, and I actually got a license when I got the Tape Cassette 2 plugin. I wasn't sure about it at first, but after using the Tape Cassette 2 for a while and realizing how good quality that plugin is, I decided to install this one, and I'm super glad I did, because it's basically a free version of XFER LFO Tool, WA Production Dodge Pro, Nicky Romero's Kickstart. It doesn't have all the features of something like LFO Tool, but it's designed to do one thing, volume shape, and create a fake sidechain effect, and for that, it's really good. I'm going to play back a little bit of the demo track as a whole so you can listen to it again, and then I'm going to break down the processing I did on each component. For processing on the Yamaha Studio piano, it came with a compressor and equalizer on the channel, and all I did was add an instance of Tape Cassette 2 and an instance of Flux Mini. I added a good amount of saturation, left the low-pass filter where it was, added a tiny bit of noise that's barely audible. I moved the wow up to 9.7%, the flutter up to 8.6%, and bumped up the output a little bit. For the distorted electric piano that comes in at the beginning of the demo track, I left the stock Logic preset as is and only added some volume shaping to it to give it that kind of ebb and flow. Otherwise, no additional processing. For processing on the first bass, the Alchemy Dark Pluck bass, I used an instance of Tape Cassette 2 followed by Chow Tape model in series on the channel, and at the end I used an instance of Flux Mini to do some volume shaping, a slightly different curve than the other two. I did a little bit more aggressive processing on Tape Cassette 2 and some minor processing on Chow Tape. Tape Cassette 2 is doing most of the work there, using the saturation knob driven all the way to add some nice grit and punch to that bass, as well as a good amount of wow and flutter to have the pitch shift as the bass sound plays out, and then I used a little bit of tape degradation and tape loss, as well as some chew from Chow Tape model. Moving on to the 808 bass, I used an instance of Tape Cassette 2 with a preset I made, as well as another instance of Chow Tape model, once again in series, no volume shaping this time, basically dialed in a similar sound to what I had on the last bass, but more fitting for an 808. For the 16th note hi-hat pattern, I used Chow Tape model with the TC260 preset just to give a bit of saturation and tape sound to the hi-hat. Didn't mess with many of the settings, left it pretty much as is. Using the tape plugin on that hi-hat sound rolled off some of the high frequencies, which made it fit a lot better for lo-fi music, and it added some variation in terms of pitch for the hi-hat, nothing too dramatic, but enough to give it a vintage sampled sound. For processing on the snare and the Type Trap kit, I did a pretty common trick for giving any sound a lo-fi sound, which is roll off a lot of the low ends, roll off a lot of the high ends, and for a snare it gives it more of a mid-range punch without any of the high frequencies that you'd get from a cleaner snare sound. And for the kick, I did something similar, where I rolled off a ton of the high end and bumped some of the punchy frequencies around 80 Hz and 200 Hz. Took a pretty big cut, 10 decibels here at 1000 Hz. For processing on the 8th note hi-hat sound, I used an instance of tape bus on the main bus, just a little bit of saturation and high-end compression, but the main thing here on the hi-hat channel is I used a pretty dramatic EQ cut from 7500 Hz and above, cut off all of those frequencies, and I added a pretty big bell curve boost around 4500 Hz. For the percussion sound, I didn't do any processing on that channel at all, but what's important to note about these 3 drum sounds right here is that I routed them to a separate drum bus where I have an instance of Chow Tape with some pretty dramatic tape emulation effects going on. I'll play back all 3 drum sounds together and turn Chow Tape on and off. That's pretty much it for the demo track. Overall, these are 3 great free plugins from small developers. I'm really impressed with each one. I definitely find myself gravitating towards Tape Cassette 2 and Chow Tape model more than Tape Bus. I don't have any major complaints with any of these plugins, but I have noticed some bugs that I figure I should talk about. On Tape Bus, when you put an instance of it on a channel and turn it on without any processing, it does raise the volume of that channel, which I don't really like. I think it should be set up so that it auto gains. You should have the exact same level coming in and out of the plugin when it's turned on without any of the processing happening. That's the only issue I've noticed with it. With Tape Cassette 2, one weird bug I noticed is that if I duplicate a channel that has an instance of Tape Cassette 2 on it, it will glitch it out so that audio is only playing through the right channel. It's a little bit annoying. It's definitely something that could be fixed down the line, and the way you can get around that is by saving your preset, removing the instance of Tape Cassette, putting a new instance on that channel, and then going to that preset to fix it. And then one thing I noticed on version 2.7 of Chow Tape model, and it might have been fixed, but I'm kind of not willing to try it, is if you go to filters and use this makeup option right here when it's on, it was causing huge noise spikes in Logic. I'm using Logic 10.5.1 on Mojave, so it's a slightly older version of Logic on an older operating system. Maybe there's some sort of issue there, but I was noticing a really weird issue using that makeup control, so I avoid it completely. I really hope you enjoyed a look at these 3 different tape plugins. I had a lot of fun making this video and diving a bit deeper into the plugins, and I'm looking forward to making more videos like this. Thanks for watching.